Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a good evening. And thank you so much, Shangri-La, for the introduction. Just to reiterate, my name is Madison Roberts, and my thesis was on integrating compassionate conservation to policy, a case studies of wolves, coyotes, and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. For the remainder of this presentation, I'll be referring to the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife as the WDFW. Just a quick run of the show. So I'll be explaining my research question and why I chose to study this topic, and then I'll give some background on what is conservation and what is compassionate conservation before moving on to my methods, results, and discussion. So I chose this topic because I wanted to explore how an emerging conservation paradigm, compassionate conservation, fits into a modern environmental policy framework. And I explored this using the research question, to what extent is compassionate conservation theory utilized in the WDFW? And I did this through a lens of a case study between wolves and coyotes. So what is conservation? Traditionally, conservation has a lot of anthropocentric beliefs, and it incorporates economics, focusing on how the environment can best be used by humans and best benefit the human race in the present and in the future. However, scholars like Michael Soleil have questioned whether this focus on humans makes it conservation or if it makes it a wildlife management plan. So how did compassionate conservation arise? It arose to challenge that anthropocentric narrative, as well as three tenets of conservation, which are instrumentalism, collectivism, and nativism. Instrumentalism is a belief that animals and nature inherently can be benefit humans and are used to our benefit, whereas collectivism is the belief that the population is best served by the individual, and it doesn't really focus on the individual well-being of animals. Nativism is the belief that if a species is introduced to a biome, or if it's not native to it, then it will inherently bring it damage at some point. These have been long critiqued within conservation, and compassionate conservation has been rising to the forefront now because we have developed research in not only how we harm wildlife and how our ability to harm wildlife is increasing, but also we have been more aware of the unintended consequences of our conservation actions, as well as research in individual personalities within animals and animal cognition. Compassionate conservation has three main theories within it. However, there is no definition. These different theories are different principles of it. One is by Ramp and Beckoff, they suggested 4 core principles of compassionate conservation: do no harm, individuals matter, inclusivity, and peaceful coexistence. Whereas Wallach suggested a virtue ethics approach to compassionate conservation, which focuses more on the thoughts and emotions within animals as opposed to an action-based narrative. And then more recently, in 2025, Lynn and their co-authors suggested that there are 7 maxims of compassionate conservation, and they arrived at this conclusion through a survey of different compassionate conservation scholars. These maxims are alignment, the acknowledgement that the practice is not value neutral and serves specific values. Coexistence, the goal is to promote the ability of people, animals, and nature to flourish together. Deliberation, using compassion, must be deliberate in envisioning and implementing any conservation practice. Cooperation, practices should align with nature. Honesty, be honest in the tensions surrounding conflicting conservation practices. Restraint, acknowledging that sometimes inaction or reduced action is actually the best action. And scrutiny, actions that impact the well-being of other animals must have strict scientific and ethical scrutiny before being undertaken. Just a little bit of background on coyotes and wolves in Washington. So the wolves are controlled by the WDFW through a gray wolf management plan that was created in 2011 to 2011 by a citizen advisory group. And this was in response to the fact that wolves are still federally listed as an endangered species in parts of Washington and still considered at risk in Washington itself. The official plan was adopted in 2011 with goals to have 15 breeding pairs for at least 3 years while controlling wolves that prey on livestock. Coyote conservation within the WDFW is more hands-off. The WDFW mainly responds to direct incidents of coyote and human interaction. Although most cases requiring coyote management are actually recommended that they be contracted out by third parties like municipalities to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. There are 3 laws that cover coyotes within Washington. I primarily focused on the fact that a state license is required to hunt or trap coyotes unless that coyote is on your property, damaging crops or domestic animals. And I chose to study coyotes and wolves in response to this within the WDFW for compassionate conservation because I see them as 2 ends of the conservation spectrum. You have wolves, which are like a charismatic carnivore who are federally and state listed, and then you have coyotes, which are seen by a lot of people as a nuisance animal and have a lot of interaction with humans. For my methods, I chose the qualitative textual analysis approach. This is mainly because compassionate conservation relies a lot on context and nuance within its practice. And so I felt that using qualitative textual analysis would help me examine the processes, mechanisms, and belief systems within the WDFW to the best ability. And then I did this through a coding system, which helped me reduce the data into patterns for analysis. And I ended up with 13 inductive codes and 5 deductive codes. Some of these codes were like examining if language within the document that I was reading had mentioned resources, the social structure of wolves, economic benefits, whether they referred to the animal as individual, and if there were non-lethal or lethal deterrents mentioned. The 2 overarching themes from my research were compassionate conservation or not compassionate conservation. For the documents I examined, I used 3 categories: general documents, coyotes, and wolves. The general documents were used as a baseline to see how WDFW examined conservation and their conservation practices in general. And it consisted of their 32 policy overviews through their commission and then the WDFW mission statement. For coyotes, there isn't much done by the WDFW, but they do have a webpage for coyotes, and their practices are in line with the 3 Washington laws. And then finally, for wolves, which had the most data available, I examined the 2011 management plan and the EIS that inspired it, and then the 2020 to 2024 wolf reports, along with the WDFW webpage for wolves. So what were my results? In the general category, there was a heavy trend towards traditional conservation. And you could see that you could see instrumentalism through like their heavy use of the words resources and management, and their focus on how animals and species could contribute to the human population. Then you could see collectivism through their emphasis on populations. There's rarely individual species discussed within their policies. And then you see nativism through their focus on preserving native species and conservation over all else. For coyotes, this was kind of mixed in that in terms of practice, WDFW mainly does actions involving coyotes for lethal deterrence or removing them from the area and relocating them, which is not considered compassionate under compassionate conservation theory. However, they do have on their webpage a lot of tips to reduce human conflict with coyotes, and that in itself, having that available makes it somewhat compassionate. Some of the quotes that I directly analyzed or like would use within my coding were the acknowledgement that humans increase the likelihood of conflicts with coyotes by deliberately or inadvertently feeding the animals, acknowledging that is part of compassionate conservation. And then, however, they do have language like coyotes have since taken advantage of human activities to expand their range. However, coyotes don't really take advantage of that so much as they just respond to what we're doing, and that places an unfair burden on the coyotes. For wolves, there was also mixed results. You could see that they suggested that lethal control be limited to solitary individuals or territorial pairs. And they did this even after acknowledging that research shows doing any lethal control actually has limited to no effects. So that's not very compassionate of them. But they do acknowledge the importance of pack social structures to recovery of wolf populations. So overall, I found that the WDFW mainly employs traditional conservation methods, which isn't that surprising. However, they do have some areas where they allow compassion to be shown through their work. And just an example of how the maxims might apply to this, if you look at the maxim of scrutiny, there's no mistaking that the WDFW does a lot of great research and great work. And so they have high scientific scrutiny for the species that they look at. However, their ethical scrutiny and how they apply ethics to that situation afterwards could use some work. So what's next? What does this mean? Implications, I definitely agree with Soleil that it's definitely a more wildlife management approach compared to conservation approach, considering how little we look at the animals' well-being and welfare within their actions. And then economic and resource management should not be the key to conservation. That's not the point of it. That benefits humans, not the animals. And then we need more acknowledgement of individuals, as well as the fact that non-native species should be taken more into consideration within our conservation. For future research, I would add maybe survey or interviews with WDFW employees to get a better understanding of the more internal decision-making processes that we don't see, as well as including more documents. Originally for my research, I wanted to look at public comments as well for any laws and policies in regards to wolves and coyotes. However, I just ran out of time, but I think that those would have yielded some interesting results. Additionally, I think that there's GIS research capabilities. You can see on their website that while they mention they have a lot of coyote mapping data, they don't actually make that available to the public and they don't actually use it as efficiently as they could. Whereas with like wolves, you can see every single wolf pack, where it is, where it's been, and that's all available to the public. And finally, one thing that could happen is you could create a practical framework, at least a hypothetical practical framework, to influence how compassionate conservation might be used in the future for policy decisions. And I just want to say thank you to Shangri-La Joshi, my reader, who helped me throughout this whole process, as well as Hannah Thompson-Garner of NARN and Francisco Santiago Avila of Washington Wildlife First, who helped me understand the nuances of compassionate conservation and helped me throughout this whole process. And then thank you to everyone else for listening.